Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. Crystal McDowell's life was marked by hardship and heartbreak from the very beginning. Her struggles began at birth, when her parents named her after the drug crystal meth, setting the tone for a difficult and chaotic childhood. Both of her parents, addicts themselves, contracted AIDS through substance abuse and passed away within 6 months of each other when Crystal was only 11 years old. This devastating loss left her completely alone, thrust into a world where she had to navigate life on her own. Despite her tender age, she was left to fend for herself, grappling with an unimaginable tragedy no child should have to endure. But fate had even more painful trials in store for Crystal. During her teenage years, she was abducted by a man and held captive in a chicken coop, subjected to horrific abuse for several days. Yet, in the face of unimaginable cruelty, Crystal's will to survive burned bright. With incredible strength and resilience, she managed to escape her captor, running toward a future that was uncertain but hers to claim. She eventually found solace with her aunt and uncle in Baytown, Texas. And though she had endured unimaginable suffering, Crystal refused to let her traumatic past define her. Determined to build a better life, she fought hard to overcome the shadows of her early years. It was in Baytown that she met Steve McDowell, a man whose fun-loving personality and carefree nature seemed to offer her the joy and stability she had been missing. Steve, with his playful charm, love for video games, and passion for fast cars, captured Crystal's heart. His kind and humorous demeanor was exactly what she needed, and her friends couldn't help but notice how much happiness he brought into her life. Crystal, now working as a flight attendant with ExpressJet, found a new sense of adventure as she and Steve took advantage of her airline perks, traveling across the U.S. together. Soon after, they married and started a family, welcoming 2 children, Madden and Maui, into their world. Crystal's devotion to her children was undeniable. She poured her heart into being the best mother she could, always putting their needs and happiness above all else. On the outside, they seemed like the perfect family, a loving couple, raising 2 beautiful children. But beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Over time, Crystal grew increasingly dissatisfied with her marriage. After a decade together, she made the difficult decision to end her relationship with Steve. This choice was not an easy one, and it was met with resistance from her husband, who wasn't ready to let go. While waiting for the renovations on her new home to be completed, Crystal continued living under the same roof as Steve and their children. It was an incredibly tense and awkward situation as the couple tried to navigate the emotional turmoil of an impending divorce while still sharing a home. Despite the challenges, Crystal remained determined to build a brighter future for herself and her kids. By 2017, Crystal was 37 years old and ready for a fresh start. She had shifted her focus to a new career in real estate and was eagerly looking forward to moving into her new home. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a chance to rewrite her story and leave the past behind. But on August 25, 2017, things took a tragic turn. That evening, Crystal was supposed to meet up with her family to watch the highly anticipated Mayweather versus McGregor fight. It was an event everyone had been looking forward to, filled with excitement and energy, but Crystal never arrived. At first, no one was too concerned. After all, Crystal was a busy, hard-working mother, and it wasn't unusual for her to run late or get caught up in her responsibilities. But as the hours stretched into the night and her phone remained silent, worry began to creep in. When more than 24 hours passed without any word from Crystal, her family's concern turned to fear. They made the gut-wrenching decision to contact the Chambers County Sheriff's Department and report her missing. A deputy was dispatched to Crystal's home, where he questioned her ex-husband Steve about her disappearance. Steve, who was still living in the home due to their ongoing divorce, told the deputy that Crystal had been seeing someone new after their separation and had a habit of disappearing without explanation. But as the deputy listened to Steve, something didn't feel right. There was something in Steve's tone, something that set off alarm bells in the officer's mind. His gut told him that this situation wasn't as simple as it seemed. With growing suspicion, the deputy called for backup, and soon a seasoned detective arrived to join the investigation. As they spoke with Steve, they couldn't help but notice that despite his divorce from Crystal, Steve still wore his wedding ring. A small detail, but one that seemed to carry a heavy weight. This unusual detail, the fact that Steve was still wearing his wedding band 6 months after their divorce, instantly piqued the detective's curiosity. Though Steve was cooperative, there was something off in his demeanor, a subtle unease that couldn't be ignored. Given the strange circumstances surrounding Crystal's disappearance, the detective escalated the case by involving the district attorney. The district attorney, after reviewing the reports, quickly suspected foul play. The evidence, though circumstantial, was beginning to point toward a possible homicide. One detail that immediately caught her attention was that, despite being divorced, Crystal and Steve had still been living under the same roof. This raised a red flag. Adding to the tension was the fact that Crystal had recently started a new relationship. The DA couldn't shake the feeling that Steve had something to hide. While many suspected Steve's involvement, the lead detective wasn't so sure. He believed it was equally important to investigate Crystal's boyfriend, who might provide valuable insight into her sudden disappearance. Crystal's vanishing left the investigators puzzled. They scoured every detail of her last known movements, desperate to piece together what had happened. They soon discovered that, on the night of August 24, 2017, she had gone out with Paul Hargrave, a local man who managed a well-known jewelry store that had been a neighborhood fixture for over 50 years. According to Paul, he and Crystal spent the evening together, and she returned to his house afterward. The next morning, while Paul was in the shower, Crystal left his home. He provided security footage that backed up his claim, showing Crystal leaving his residence at 7:35 a.m. on August 25th, driving away in her black Mercedes coupe. With both Steve and Paul now considered suspects, the investigation grew more complex. However, the detectives knew there were still other potential persons of interest to explore. As they dug deeper into Crystal's life, they unearthed some surprising details about her marriage. It was revealed that, throughout her time with Steve, Crystal had engaged in several extramarital affairs, some with fellow flight attendants and pilots, both men and women. While this discovery raised suspicions about possible motives for revenge, there was no hard evidence linking these affairs to her disappearance. Then, just as the investigation seemed to be gaining momentum, it hit a devastating roadblock. Hurricane Harvey made landfall in Baytown, unleashing widespread destruction. Half the county was submerged in floodwaters, and the relentless rain brought everything, including the search for Crystal, to a grinding halt. The devastation was so severe that the Chambers County Sheriff's Department was forced to divert all available resources to disaster relief efforts. As families lost homes, cars, and even loved ones, Crystal's disappearance was tragically overshadowed by the hurricane's aftermath. With law enforcement stretched thin, it fell to Crystal's family and friends to continue the search. They worked tirelessly, flooding social media with posts on Facebook and Instagram, hoping someone might come forward with information. Their determination paid off when one of Crystal's cousins received a tip from a friend. The friend claimed to have seen a Snapchat photo showing Crystal's car parked at a Motel 6, near Interstate 10. The cousin acted immediately, rushing to verify the information. When they saw the photo, they recognized the license plate. It was indeed Crystal's Mercedes. Armed with this confirmation, they contacted the family and notified the police. Unfortunately, the severe flooding made it nearly impossible to reach the motel by conventional means. Undeterred, they used airboats to navigate the flooded roads. Upon arrival at the Motel 6, their worst fears were realized. Crystal's car was abandoned in the parking lot, the keys still in the ignition. It was clear that whoever left the car there intended for it to be stolen. The Mercedes was quickly towed to a crime lab for processing, but to everyone's disappointment, no evidence was found that could offer clues to Crystal's fate. The case even attracted national attention, with popular investigative shows like Dateline covering Crystal's story. But despite the exposure, no substantial leads emerged. A week passed with no sign of Crystal, and the lead detective, realizing he needed more support in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, reached out to the Texas Rangers for assistance. The Texas Rangers quickly stepped in, and one of their lead investigators took the reins. The first step was conducting a formal interview with Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband. Steve claimed that he hadn't seen Crystal since she left for her date on August 24th. But from the moment the Ranger began speaking with Steve, he sensed something off. Despite his ex-wife's mysterious disappearance, Steve didn't exhibit the kind of anxiety or concern one would expect from someone in his position. His body language was telling. Still, Crystal's friends and family stood by Steve, insisting that he couldn't possibly be involved. They painted a picture of a loving father, devoted to their children, Madden and Maui. They couldn't imagine him doing anything to harm Crystal, the mother of his kids. But the Texas Ranger wasn't swayed. In an effort to clear Steve from suspicion or uncover the truth, he asked if Steve would be willing to take a lie detector test. Steve, confident in his innocence, agreed to the test without hesitation. But when the results came in, they were nothing short of shocking. Steve failed the polygraph, miserably raising even more questions about his involvement in Crystal's disappearance. To complicate matters further, Paul Hargrave, Crystal's boyfriend, also failed his polygraph test, leaving investigators grappling with a new level of uncertainty. With both men now under suspicion, the district attorney began to wonder if there was a possible conspiracy at play, a joint effort to cover up the truth of what had happened to Crystal. Everyone involved was now certain of one thing: foul play was at hand, and it was increasingly likely that Crystal was no longer alive. But one crucial question remained: where was her body? The harsh reality was that if Crystal's remains had been dumped into one of Baytown's many bayous, it was entirely possible they had been washed out to the Gulf of Mexico, making recovery nearly impossible. Despite this grim possibility, her family needed answers. To bring closure and some peace to those who loved her, a massive search was organized on September 9th. Nearly 100 volunteers, along with the Texas ECW search team, combed through the area, scouring every inch of land on ATVs and airboats, using a grid system to ensure no stone was left unturned. Yet, despite their best efforts, no trace of Crystal was found. As the search dragged on, the Texas Rangers remained resolute. They were determined to find not only Crystal, but also the truth. Could Steve or Paul really have been involved? Or was there another explanation? The Rangers pursued every lead, searching for clues that might explain Crystal's disappearance and uncover the motive behind it. The investigation shifted when the ranger leading the case focused on the Motel 6 where Crystal's car had been found. He knew there had to be CCTV footage from nearby businesses or homes. After hours spent combing through countless recordings, the ranger finally hit a breakthrough. Footage from a nearby camera showed a man parking Crystal's Mercedes in the Motel 6 lot at 6:37 a.m. on August 26th. The figure wasn't immediately recognizable, but as the ranger watched the video closely, something clicked. The man exited Crystal's car and casually walked away, blending into the morning quiet. The ranger's suspicions grew when, just hours later, a blue Mustang GT, a rare model matching Steve McDowell's car, was caught on camera pulling into a gas station next to the motel. The footage showed Steve walking toward the Motel 6 parking lot, glancing in the direction of Crystal's abandoned car. The ranger speculated that Steve had returned to check if anyone had stolen the vehicle, having left the keys in the ignition to encourage theft. But a new question emerged. If Steve had been responsible for Crystal's disappearance, how did he get home? The distance between the motel and Steve's house was considerable, and it seemed unlikely he would have walked. Determined to solve this puzzle, the ranger reviewed more footage from the area. His efforts paid off when he spotted a man riding a bike, in the rain, along the Interstate 10 service road at 7:05 a.m. Just 25 minutes after Crystal's car had been left at the Motel 6, the bike had distinctive mag wheels, and it reminded the ranger of something he had seen in the McDowell garage during a prior visit. His suspicions deepened when Steve mentioned, during one of their interviews, that he had been shopping at Walmart the morning of Crystal's disappearance. Intrigued, the ranger pulled the CCTV footage from Walmart, located just across the street from the motel. The footage revealed a chilling detail. A man, resembling Steve, entered Walmart that same morning, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and paying cash for a bike with mag wheels. It was just minutes after Crystal's car had been abandoned at the motel. With mounting evidence, the ranger summoned Steve for another interview. This time, he confronted Steve directly, laying out the case against him piece by piece. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Steve denied any involvement, claiming innocence once again. But the ranger was now certain. Paul Hargrave had no role in this tragedy. The truth lay with Steve McDowell. While the ranger believed they had gathered enough evidence to charge Steve with Crystal's murder, there was still one critical element missing: Crystal's body. Without it, the case was built on circumstantial evidence and testimony, strong but not unbreakable. The district attorney was adamant that finding Crystal's remains was essential to securing a conviction. Not only would it strengthen the legal case, but it would also give Crystal's family the closure they so desperately needed. The absence of her body was torturing her loved ones. Every day that passed without answers brought more heartache, more pain. They needed to know where Crystal was, what had happened to her. But the stakes grew higher when Steve's behavior became more erratic. Several people had come forward, telling the Texas Rangers that, after Crystal filed for divorce, Steve had made dark, disturbing comments about murder and taking his own life. Fearing for the safety of Crystal and Steve's children, Madden and Maui, the DA took swift action. The children were removed from Steve's custody and placed under protective care. Desperate to find Crystal and put an end to this nightmare, the district attorney made a bold move. He offered Steve a deal. If he led them to Crystal's body, he would consider allowing him to see his children again. Steve, however, had his own proposal. He asked if he could return home for the night and promised to tell them everything the next morning, even offering to take them directly to where Crystal's body was. It was a risky move, one that left the DA and investigators torn. On one hand, it offered a glimmer of hope that they might finally get his answers. On the other hand, they worried Steve might use the opportunity to flee or harm himself, taking the truth with him forever. Despite the risks, they agreed. Steve returned home that night under the watchful eyes of law enforcement. The following morning, September 9th, the DA and the Texas Rangers arrived at Steve's house, hoping he would keep his word and finally reveal the truth. Steve answered the door, his demeanor calm but tense, as if the weight of the situation was finally beginning to sink in. During his interview with the ranger and the district attorney, he opened up in a way he hadn't before. Steve began by explaining that he had known about Crystal's numerous affairs throughout their marriage. According to Steve, when he confronted her, Crystal dismissed his concerns, telling him to stay out of her business. She bluntly confessed that she had sought intimacy outside their relationship because she felt he wasn't dominant enough for her in the bedroom. As the interview progressed, the ranger and the DA decided to take a more empathetic approach, hoping it would help Steve feel comfortable enough to divulge the details of what really happened. The ranger pretended to understand Steve's feelings, trying to create a safe space for him to let his guard down. Despite their efforts, Steve remained tight-lipped, clinging to his silence about Crystal's disappearance. Eventually, though, Steve broke. The confession came slowly at first, but once he started speaking, the story of that fateful day spilled out. According to Steve, it all started with an argument between him and Crystal. During the heated exchange, Crystal told him she no longer loved him, a revelation that crushed him. Enraged and overwhelmed, Steve admitted that in a moment of impulse, he suffocated her. He insisted, however, that it wasn't premeditated and that he had never intended to harm her, claiming it was a tragic accident. But Steve didn't stop there. After Crystal's death, panic set in. He quickly decided to conceal what he had done. He wrapped her body in trash bags and placed it in the trunk of her Mercedes. In the dark of night, Steve drove to a remote location and disposed of her body by tossing it into a ravine. With the confession finally out, Steve agreed to lead the authorities to the site where he had left Crystal's remains. But he had one condition. The death penalty had to be taken off the table. Knowing that without Steve's cooperation, they might never recover Crystal's body, the district attorney reluctantly agreed. The search took them to a narrow, isolated road called Needle Point, bordered by thick woods that seemed to close in around them. With Steve's guidance, they combed the area and eventually, they came upon Crystal's remains. The scene was nothing short of horrifying. Time and the elements had reduced much of what was left, making identification difficult and adding a grim finality to the tragedy. Steve was arrested and charged with Crystal's murder. But the legal battle was far from over. His defense team announced their intention to argue for the sudden passion defense, a Texas law that could potentially reduce the murder charge. Under this clause, Steve's lawyers planned to argue that Crystal's harsh words during their argument, her declaration that she no longer loved him, had triggered a moment of uncontrollable rage leading to her death. In Texas, the sudden passion defense hinges on the claim that an individual acted in a state of extreme emotional disturbance, such as rage or terror, which clouds their judgment and leads to impulsive actions. If the defense could convince the court that Crystal's provocation led directly to Steve's response, he could receive a lesser sentence or even avoid the murder charge altogether. While the DA was determined to hold Steve accountable, the introduction of this defense strategy threatened to complicate the case. For Crystal's family, it felt like yet another betrayal, a final insult to the memory of a woman who had already endured so much in her life. As they waited for the trial, the community could only hope that justice for Crystal would ultimately prevail. If Steve and his legal team had successfully argued the sudden passion defense, the charge would have been downgraded to a second-degree felony. This would have significantly reduced the potential penalty, with Steve facing 2 to 20 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. However, a conviction for first-degree murder would carry a much harsher sentence, 5 to 99 years in prison, along with the same maximum fine. The sudden passion defense in Crystal's case sparked heated debates among legal scholars and the public. Critics argued that it essentially blamed the victim, downplaying the perpetrator's guilt and shifting the focus away from the violence committed. On the other hand, proponents of the defense suggested that it allows for an understanding of emotional responses during extreme situations while still holding the defendant accountable. The district attorney, however, firmly believed that this was a clear case of premeditated murder, not one of sudden passion. To convict Steve of first-degree murder, all 12 jurors would need to unanimously agree. After a long year of pretrial motions and hearings, Steve's trial finally began in June 2019. The prosecution laid out a strong case starting with Steve's confession, which provided critical evidence of his guilt. They also presented the CCTV footage of Steve abandoning Crystal's car in the motel parking lot, further implicating him in the cover-up of her death. One of the most emotional moments of the trial came when Crystal and Steve's children were brought in to testify. Their 7-year-old daughter, Maui, took the stand and recounted what she witnessed the night her mother was killed. In heartbreaking detail, Maui told the jury that her parents had been arguing about Crystal seeing another man. She described how, during the fight, she saw her father place his hands over her mother's nose and mouth, suffocating her. Maui remembered watching her mother struggle for breath until she went still. Afterward, Steve told Maui to stay in her room and to never speak about what she had seen, leaving the little girl terrified and confused. The defense, however, pushed back, claiming that Maui's testimony had been influenced by Crystal's relatives and that she had fabricated the story. They argued that Maui was repeating things she had overheard rather than recounting her own experiences. In a risky move, Steve himself took the stand, offering a tearful and revised version of events. He contradicted his original confession, claiming that the argument with Crystal had spiraled out of control and that, in a misguided attempt to calm her down, he had placed her in a bear hug. Steve insisted that he never intended to hurt Crystal, but that she unexpectedly went limp in his arms, suggesting her death was a tragic accident. The district attorney was stunned by the sudden change in Steve's story. The idea that he had hugged Crystal to death seemed implausible and left the courtroom in shock. As the case was handed over to the jury, the DA grew anxious. The jury's request to review Steve's confession video raised concerns about the possibility of a mistrial. A mistrial would mean starting the entire process over again, a prospect that weighed heavily on the minds of the prosecution and Crystal's grieving family. However, just an hour after reviewing the footage, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Steve McDowell guilty of murder, delivering long-awaited justice for Crystal. The guilty verdict brought a sense of closure to her family and friends who had been living in uncertainty and anguish since her disappearance. During the sentencing phase, Steve's defense team attempted to argue once again that the murder was a crime of sudden passion, hoping to reduce his sentence. But the jury rejected this argument, recognizing the gravity of his actions. In the end, Steve McDowell was sentenced to 50 years in prison, ensuring that he would pay for the life he had taken and the pain he had caused. Crystal's family could finally begin to heal, knowing that justice had been served. Story 2. Imagine a cold, dimly lit basement in a quiet Czech town, where the air smells of decay and the walls seem to press in with a weight that feels almost alive. In the flickering shadows, two small figures crouch inside crude cages. Children, though their thin, battered bodies make them barely recognizable. They are covered in bruises and wounds, evidence of months of unimaginable suffering. This was not a scene from a horror film. It was a cruel reality that police uncovered in 2007, one of the most horrifying cases of child abuse in recent history. At the center of it were two sisters, Klara and Katerina Morova, whose lives would take a dark and tragic turn no one could have foreseen. Klara was the eldest daughter in a seemingly normal family. Born in 1975, she grew up with her sister in Kazim, a small, peaceful village about 120 miles from Prague. It was a quiet, picturesque place where life moved at an easy pace, with good schools and a strong sense of community. The kind of town where things like this shouldn't happen. Little is known about the Morova sisters' early years, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right with Klara from a young age. She was a pretty child, with blonde hair and bright blue eyes, but beneath her innocent appearance her mind was beginning to unravel. Early signs of schizophrenia started to surface. Schizophrenia is a brutal disorder, twisting a person's perception of reality, causing them to see and believe things that aren't there. For Klara, these delusions took on a religious form, filling her head with strange fantasies of divine purpose. No official diagnosis was ever made, but those around Klara noticed the change. Over time, her younger sister Katerina, like many siblings, began to mimic her. Unfortunately, what she copied was not just her sister's behavior, but her increasingly unstable mental state. Together, they fell deeper into their shared world of religious delusions. They convinced themselves that they were chosen for some higher purpose, feeding off each other's fantasies until their grip on reality was barely there. Despite their growing madness, Klara managed to live a seemingly ordinary life. She finished school, went to university to study pedagogy, and even found love with a man who accepted her, flaws and all. They married and, for a brief time, it seemed like things were looking up. When their first child, Jacob, was born, it was a moment of hope, a sign that Klara might escape the darkness in her mind and build a life full of love and normalcy. But the darkness was never far behind, and soon it would consume everything. Nearly 2 years after the birth of her first child, Klara was pregnant again and soon welcomed her second son, Andrei. But while the family grew, so did the cracks in her relationship with her husband. As time passed, Klara's erratic behavior, her mood swings, and even bouts of aggression became too much for her husband to handle. Eventually, it all reached a breaking point, and he left, abandoning Klara with their 2 young boys. Despite the heartbreak, Klara did her best to keep life moving forward for her children. She was dedicated to their studies, encouraging their involvement in activities like summer camps, school events, and family vacations. Outwardly, she was still fulfilling her role as a mother, but inside, the loneliness and resentment weighed heavily on her, dragging her deeper into depression. In her isolation, Klara turned to the one person she trusted, her younger sister, Katerina. Hoping that her sister's presence might ease her emotional burden, Klara invited Katerina to move in with her and the boys. It was during this time that a new figure entered their lives, a girl named Anichka who claimed to be just 12 years old. Some reports say Klara met Anichka at university, where the girl told her she had run away from a youth care center after suffering mistreatment. Others suggest that Katerina, who worked at a local youth institution, encountered Anichka, who said she had escaped from a human trafficking ring. There were many stories about how Anichka came into their lives, but all led to the same unsettling truth. This child was no ordinary girl. The Morova sisters, driven by their own delusions and religious fervor, welcomed Anichka into their home with open arms. To them, she seemed like a gift, an innocent, vulnerable girl who needed protection. But Anichka was hiding an extraordinary secret. She wasn't a helpless child at all. In reality, she was a 32-year-old woman named Barbara Skrilova. Barbara suffered from a condition that made her appear much younger than she was. With her childlike face and small stature, she had perfected the art of deception, manipulating those around her into believing she was a vulnerable young girl. She exploited this to gain sympathy and secure a place in the homes of people who were moved by her tragic backstory. There are reports of one family who took her in, convinced they were adopting a young girl in need. However, Barbara's violent and unpredictable behavior soon surfaced, and the family discovered the shocking truth about her real age, leading to her return to the state's child welfare system. Barbara's history was filled with stints in psychiatric institutions, from which she often managed to escape. But none of this was known to Clara and Katerina. To them, Anichka was a helpless child in need of love and care. They quickly grew attached to her, and before long, they made the fateful decision to adopt her. A decision that would lead directly to disaster. At first, everything seemed to go smoothly with the addition of the so-called child to the family. But it wasn't long before Barbara began to feel envious of the loving attention Clara's biological children received. She started causing trouble, engaging in mischievous behavior and creating disruptions, for which she then blamed the two young boys, ages 10 and 8. The boys, in turn, were unfairly reprimanded, often without reason. These increasingly tense situations undoubtedly worsened the fragile mental state of the Morova sisters. It appears that Barbara's skillful manipulation gave her control over the sisters, allowing her to slowly influence their decisions. Around this time, Barbara began discussing the religion she followed, called the Grail movement. Research into this group shows it to be an apocalyptic religious organization that believes in a coming transformation of society. Followers, organized into small groups known as circles, interpret the teachings in their own way, guided by the idea that good deeds on earth will ensure a place in heaven. However, it seems that within some circles, these good deeds were believed to absolve members of any wrongs they may have committed. Barbara belonged to one of these circles and soon convinced Clara and Katerina to join her. According to various accounts, this particular group was involved in troubling practices, including violence, exploitation, and other morally questionable acts. At the center of this group was a mysterious figure known as the Doctor, who communicated with his followers through text messages, issuing instructions that were often beyond comprehension. One of the first deeply concerning actions, which went largely unnoticed, was when Clara withdrew her son Andrei from school, claiming he had become deaf and mute and that she would be homeschooling him. This marked the beginning of a descent into something far darker for the family. From that moment on, any wrongdoings, whether genuine or made up by Barbara, led to Jacob and Andrei experiencing severe punishments. They were hit with disproportionate force for their transgressions, whether real or imagined, using objects as hard as spoons or belts, and even worse, being locked in small, dark rooms at night, exploiting Barbara's control over the siblings. In a more extreme approach, Barbara suggested locking the disobedient children permanently to a local blacksmith to set an example and curb their continued misconduct. The blacksmith was tasked with constructing a cage, unaware of what its purpose would be once completed. This iron cage was then installed in the house's basement, where the children were confined over several months. Clara's sons endured a nightmare filled with cruelty, following the physician's orders received via text messages. They faced torture, including being pinched repeatedly, tied up, whipped, and deprived of food for days. Being trapped in the cage, they were unable to escape, forcing them to use makeshift toilets and sleep on the dirty ground. Every week, pretending to clean up the odor, the women would drench the children and the basement with cold water. However, their suffering did not end there. At one point, the boys were taken to cabins hidden deep in the forest and locked in smaller cages. During this period, more members of the Grail movement assembled and subjected the boys to a week of brutal abuse. They were submerged in buckets of water, suffocated with plastic bags until nearly unconscious, beaten, forced into battles with each other, and made to dig what they believed were graves. Cigarettes were burned into their flesh. They were often bound by their hands and feet, their mouths sealed with tape and subjected to sexual abuse. Upon their return to their prison, located in the basement of their family residence, the circumstances took a turn for the worse. Barbara came up with a strategy to overfeed the boys while they were confined, aiming to make them gain weight. One day, the three women went down to the basement, and Clara asked her younger son to stretch his leg through the bars of the cage. The frightened child complied, and as soon as his leg was within reach, Katerina and Barbara seized it, while Clara swiftly made a cut, dividing the flesh among them, which led to hysterical laughter. This nightmare-worthy scenario persisted for roughly 6 months, from December 2006 to June 2007. During this time, Barbara came up with another ingenious plan to monitor the children. They bought baby monitoring cameras and installed one in the basement, allowing them to not only oversee the children's every move, but also witness their suffering whenever one of the women would go down to torment them while the others were busy with household tasks. Little did they know, this clever plan would ultimately lead to their downfall, in a way that seemed almost miraculous. On May 10, 2007, a neighbor of the Mawarava sisters was installing a baby monitor in his house to keep an eye on his newborn while he slept. After setting up the camera, he turned it on to ensure everything was functioning properly. To his shock, instead of seeing his baby's crib, the screen displayed a dark area where a small child, with his arms tied behind him, was struggling to eat food from the floor with his mouth. At another moment, the screen showed an adult woman's hand holding something, while the child desperately tried to consume it. The image was so disturbing that the neighbor was horrified and immediately called the police to report the appalling scene. Moments later, officers arrived at his home and were met with the horrifying images. The advanced range of their equipment made it clear that the source of this terror was very close. Determined to put an end to the nightmare as swiftly as possible, the officers began to knock on the doors of nearby homes. The initial few residents had no issue allowing the police access to every room until they reached the house where the Mawarava sisters lived. Initially, the sisters were hesitant to let the police in, but eventually relented. During the inspection, the police discovered a small door hidden under the staircase. To their shock, what they found was beyond what anyone could imagine. Stepping inside, they were overwhelmed by a terrible stench that filled the entire space. The first sight was of a terrified girl clutching a teddy bear, running directly towards the officers, screaming in fear that she and her brothers had been abused by their adoptive mother and aunt. One officer took the girl outside, while the others were left in disbelief at the sight of two nearly naked boys, their bodies covered in wounds, locked inside cages as if they were animals. One of the boys appeared unconscious. Without hesitation, the boys were immediately freed and attended to by emergency services. They quickly provided first aid and rushed them to the hospital for further treatment. The girl, who didn't seem to have any physical injuries, was taken into custody by the authorities. Clara and Katerina were arrested. Jacob had some wounds that were treated but did not require hospitalization, so both children were sent to a child protection center. However, Andre, the younger boy, was in critical condition when he arrived at the hospital. Upon realizing he had not been returned to the basement, he experienced a panic attack, began to scream that he was seeing ghosts, and begged the doctors to end his suffering. The situation could not have been more tragic. When he calmed down, the doctors could not believe what they saw in the boy. He was covered in scars, bruises, and open wounds, one of which was particularly large on one of his buttocks. He had to remain hospitalized for proper treatment. While healing physical wounds on their body, injury was caused by months of terrible violence with their mother, aunt, and others, so much harder to overcome in the meantime that research began to reveal the truth about what happened behind closed doors in this house, and at the same time in the lives of the population were placed in the care center. Believed that the young girl refused to work with advisors and professionals who showed aggression and sadness, but she also began to make mistakes that pointed out the truth during the initial assessment of her mental condition. She got paper and crayon to draw what, instead, she wanted a children's drawing. She produced complex geometric shapes and improved mathematical calculations that go beyond what could be expected from 13 years old. Unfortunately, Anika's studies were never completed. A few days after being placed in the center, she escaped through the window without leaving a trace. Security forces immediately began searching for the girl and distributed leaflets with her photograph and information. To surprise, they soon received tips from various sources who claimed that she was recognized in the picture and claimed that she was a 33-year-old woman named Barbara. Seemed to receive help from a known couple who provided her son's documents. In order to leave the country, she initially went to Denmark and from there to Oslo. In Norway, Barbara again changed her appearance and shaved her head and posed like a 13-year-old boy named Adam. She turned to the authorities and claimed she was on a ran from a malicious father. Several sources say that Adam was occupied by the family and entered a school where he was soon considered a gifted student. This charade continued for several months. But the Czech authorities did not give up and, in cooperation with international colleagues, the pieces of the puzzle were managed together. DNA analysis eventually confirmed the true identity of Barbara, which led to her arrest. After that, she was extradited back to the Czech Republic to face legal proceedings. After her return, Barbara was assessed psychologically in a number of ways. At least one expert who dealt with her reportedly noticed indications of psychotic tendencies. Among the most startling revelations was the rumored fact that a worried instructor was the reason behind Barbara's imprisonment in Norway. Barbara had drawn a picture of 7 bruised and bleeding children, each with a number, and identified herself as the 7th, which had worried the teacher when she was posing as Adam. Hundreds of reporters and television teams crowded the municipal court in the Czech city of Jarn on Friday, May 9, 2008, taking pictures of Katarina and Barbara being led inside. The two ladies were accused of tricking the personnel of a daycare center by pretending that Barbara was Annika, a 13-year-old adopted girl. They were not released even though the court apparently dismissed part of the charges. They were taken into custody right away and accused of major crimes including child abuse. For other members of the group they belonged to were also included in the charges. Visibly distraught and shrunken, Clara was spotted approaching the courtroom with her sister as the trial got underway. Along with 3 other people, Barbara also made her way into the courtroom. When Clara's turn came to testify, she confessed to abusing her kids over a period of several months. She asserted, nonetheless, that Barbara and her sister Katarina had tricked her. Clara claimed they had put her into a delusional condition, engulfing her in the Grail movement to the extent she was unable to recognize the seriousness of what she was doing. Additionally, Barbara reportedly stated that she had suffered abuse at the hands of the Morova sisters. But the court mostly disregarded her assertions and few people found her credible. Jacob and Andre had the chance to speak with the judge directly, who described the horrifying experiences they went through. They told how the accused violated their privacy, forced them to live in near starvation for months in inhumane conditions, and even cannibalized parts of their bodies. During the hearings, the officers who had entered the House of Horrors also testified. One of the officers described how they saw a youngster lying on the floor, naked, as soon as they entered the basement. He pointed out that the Morova sisters showed no concern for the child's welfare, and the girl identified as Annika even tried to block the officers by clinging to their legs. At the end of the hearings, the prosecutor stated that the motive behind these horrific acts was to force the children into complete submission to the group's religious goals. When sentencing, the judge explained that the ultimate aim of these atrocities was to utterly break the will of the children. He also noted that, although there were signs of cult involvement, there wasn't enough evidence to prove it. In the end, the judge found all 6 accused guilty and handed down their sentences. Clara Morova, the boy's mother, was sentenced to 9 years in a maximum security prison, while her sister Katarina received a 10-year sentence. The other 3 individuals were convicted of abuse and given 7 years. Barbara, then 34, was found guilty of repeated abuse and cruelty, but received a lighter sentence of only 5 years in prison. The identity of the so-called doctor, believed to be behind the group's actions, was never confirmed. Many were shocked by what seemed like surprisingly light sentences, considering the brutal violence inflicted on 2 innocent children. Moreover, Reports revealed that Barbara was released on parole after serving just half of her sentence, meaning she was out after only 2.5 years. Her lawyer argued that her deteriorating mental health played a role in her early release. Meanwhile, Jacob and Andre, with the help of specialists, have managed to overcome much of the trauma, though those events will undoubtedly stay with them forever. Story 3. Rick and Susan seem to have it all: a big house in a peaceful neighborhood, 2 lovely kids, good jobs, and financial security. But hidden within the Wemsley household were dark secrets. Things took a turn when the police received an unusual 911 call just before Christmas. When officers arrived at the quiet town of Mansville, Texas, they found the garage doors open and the side door unlocked. Inside, they discovered a tragic scene. Rick Wemsley, a well-liked local accountant, and his cheerful wife Susie were found dead. It seemed the crime had happened well before the emergency call was made. Rick and Susie knew each other from high school in Oklahoma in the 1970s, though they weren't close back then. Years later, they reconnected while Rick was at Oklahoma State University and Susie was at a Christian college. Their relationship grew, and they decided to get married, start a family, and grow old together. They tied the knot and welcomed their daughter Sarah in 1978, followed by their son Andrew 6 years later. Rick became a certified accountant and worked in the oil and gas industry. The family moved several times due to his career opportunities, eventually settling in Fort Worth, Texas, near the Trinity River. Fort Worth is a large but cozy city with a rich history. There, Rick set up his own accounting practice from home, which provided a good income. By 2003, the Wemsleys lived in an upscale neighborhood in Mansville, about 20 miles from Fort Worth. Sarah, now 25, had become a mother and lived on her own, while 19-year-old Andrew had just finished high school and was attending college while working part-time at a mini golf course. Rick and Susie had a happy marriage and celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in July 2003, with friends and family. In December of that year, Rick and Susan wanted to have a special family celebration for their 25th Christmas together. Susie put a lot of effort into making the day perfect. She spent hours picking out decorations and gifts, and she adorned their home inside and out with festive garlands and Christmas figurines. A large Christmas tree, covered in bright lights and colorful ornaments, stood in the living room, with presents wrapped and placed underneath. Susie wrapped each gift with love, imagining how happy her family would be when they opened them. This cozy holiday scene took a dark turn when, on December 11, 2003, at 11:41 p.m., the Mansville emergency dispatcher received a call from the Wemsley home. There was only silence on the other end, suggesting that someone needed help but couldn't speak. The dispatcher quickly sent a patrol car to the house. Upon arrival, the police officers circled the house, peering through the windows. They got no response from knocking or ringing the doorbell, but they found the side door to the garage open. The officers entered the home, walking through the kitchen, where they noticed the landline phone off the hook and lying on the table. In the living room, they found 45-year-old Susie Wemsley lying cold on the couch. In the foyer near the front door, they discovered 46-year-old Rick Wemsley in a pool of blood. Sadly, it was clear that both were beyond help. At 12:17 a.m., paramedics arrived and confirmed that Rick and Susie were dead. The house was immediately sealed off, and an investigation began. The autopsy revealed that Susie had died from a gunshot wound and had also been stabbed 7 times, likely after she had already passed away. It's believed she was attacked while she was dozing on the couch in the living room. Detectives discovered 2 bloody palm prints that might have been left by the perpetrator, as well as a bullet, 2 pieces of a blue plastic hair clip, and another piece of plastic on the floor nearby. Rick Wemsley met the same tragic end as his wife, but possibly not as quickly. Bullet holes in the headboard of the bed in the master bedroom suggested that the attack on Rick began there before moving to the hallway. There was no blood in the bedroom, leading investigators to believe that Rick woke up from the gunshots and either fled the room or confronted the intruder himself. It appeared that Rick wasn't willing to go down without a fight, as evidenced by a tuft of hair found in his left hand, indicating a struggle. This hair became crucial evidence. Rick was also shot and suffered approximately 11 knife wounds to his back. The detectives carefully combed through every room in the house, examining all carpets and furniture for clues. The hair found in Rick's hand and the broken hair clip on the living room floor were sent for DNA analysis. The Wemsleys' spacious home was thoroughly checked for fingerprints, and investigators searched each room for signs of robbery. Initially, they considered the possibility that the family had interrupted a burglary, causing the intruders to resort to violence. However, the excessive number of stab wounds suggested otherwise. This theory was further dismissed when nearly $115,000 in cash was discovered in the master bedroom. A thief would have easily found and taken this money, but since it remained untouched in the bedside table, robbery was ruled out as a motive. It was later confirmed that no valuables were missing from the house, and there were no signs of forced entry. Neighbors and friends were horrified by the shocking news. They couldn't fathom who would commit such a heinous act against Rick and Susie, who were beloved in the community. It is a tragedy because it's unexpected. I just couldn't believe it. You just don't think of that happening close by. The couple often hosted guests in their home and were known for their kindness and willingness to help others. The sudden brutal crime in this quiet neighborhood, especially just before the holidays, left everyone feeling anxious and fearful. Rick and Susie Wemsley appeared to have an ideal life. They lived in a spacious house, where Rick thrived as an accountant. He also enjoyed gardening and taking his son to Texas Rangers baseball games. Susie was a dedicated homemaker who kept the household running smoothly and cared deeply for their children. In her free time, she loved spending quality moments with her son and daughter. However, what occurred behind closed doors turned out to be far more troubling than the serene life they seemed to lead. According to some sources, there were more layers to this seemingly perfect family. There was always tension inside the Wemsley house, particularly concerning their two children, Sarah and Andrew. As a teenager, Sarah was kicked out of the house for misbehavior, leading her to become pregnant at 19 and enter into an unhealthy relationship with her daughter's father, Todd Cleveland. Sarah often argued with her younger brother, Andrew. The two siblings never felt much affection for each other. According to Sarah's ex-boyfriend, the Wemsley family was always wary of outsiders, even their friends, suspecting that people were only pretending to be close to them to gain something. This mistrust extended to their own family, contributing to an underlying unhappiness despite their growing prosperity. Reports suggested that Rick and Susie's marriage was unstable, although they tried to maintain appearances in public. The Wemsleys had an agreement with their children: if they enrolled in college and stayed in school, they would receive financial support. This arrangement didn't work out with Sarah, but Andrew convinced his parents that he was committed to honoring his part of the deal. As a result, Susie and Rick gifted him a new white Mustang, paid for his insurance, and provided money for other expenses. Andrew continued living at home without contributing to the household budget, and everything seemed fine except that he didn't keep up his end of the bargain. Like his sister, Andrew dropped out of college without completing his education. When his parents eventually discovered that he had left school, they stopped supporting him financially. However, they didn't go as far as to kick him out of the house. Despite the ongoing tension, Andrew, now 19, chose to spend most of his free time hanging out with friends at the local Pancake House. A restaurant specializing in breakfasts, the Pancake House was where Andrew's friend introduced him to his sister, 19-year-old Chelsea Richardson. Sarah Wemsley was informed of her parents' deaths at 4 a.m., soon after their bodies were discovered. However, the police couldn't locate the younger son, Andrew. The authorities had already appealed to the media, asking for any sightings of Andrew's white Mustang. While forensic experts continued their work at the crime scene, a white Mustang arrived at the Wemsley house. Andrew and his girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, stepped out of the car. They had been staying at Chelsea's place for several days. That morning, they learned about the tragic events at the Wemsley home. While watching the news, the police immediately asked Andrew and Chelsea to follow a service vehicle to the station for questioning. Andrew's interview lasted about 45 minutes. He revealed that he hadn't been home or communicated with his parents for several days, as he had been living with Chelsea. The police noted fresh scratches on Andrew's hand, adding to the investigation's interest. There was nothing suspicious in Andrew's story, so the police allowed him to leave the station. However, they requested that he sign a consent form permitting them to search his car. During a conversation with his sister after the interrogation, Andrew mentioned that forensic experts might find their mother's blood in the Mustang. He explained that their mother had recently cut her finger and, for some reason, had taken his car to drive to the store, which could explain any potential blood traces. Chelsea Richardson's statement at the police station matched Andrew's perfectly. She confirmed they had been together for the past 2 days and had been inseparable since they began dating the previous fall. They often spent entire nights in a 24-hour cafe playing Master Duel, a Japanese collectible card game where players use cards to battle each other, simulating battles between fantastic monsters. The game's central character was described as a weak, infantile boy who became a hero when he played. This shared interest deeply bonded Andrew and Chelsea, and they had started thinking seriously about marriage. Chelsea's mother supported their relationship and was fond of Andrew. However, Rick and Susie Wemsley were openly disappointed with Andrew's choice of partner. They had hoped for a different kind of girl for their son. The Richardsons lived on the outskirts of Fort Worth, in a working-class area known as the Blue Collar District, which was a stark contrast to the upscale neighborhood of Mansfield, where the Wemsleys lived. A few years earlier, Chelsea had lost her beloved father to a heart attack, and her mother sometimes worked 3 jobs to make ends meet. Despite their financial struggles, the Richardsons were known for their generosity. Chelsea, an extroverted and cheerful person, was quite popular at her school. Her lively and happy disposition earned her the nickname Bubbles. Chelsea Richardson's best friend, Susanna Padana, sometimes benefited from Chelsea's generosity. When Susanna had disputes with her own mother, she was warmly welcomed into the Richardson home, where she stayed for several months. The 3 teenagers Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna were together on the night of Andrew's parents' deaths. Chelsea's ex-boyfriend, Jeremy Lavender, confirmed their alibi, stating that they were at his house the entire time. Sarah Wemsley informed the police that her daughter's father, Todd Cleveland, might be involved in her parents' deaths. They had been arguing about custody, and Sarah had recently threatened to call Child Protective Services on him. A day after this threat, and about a month before the tragedy, another suspicious incident occurred. In an early November, while returning home with her parents after a horseback riding lesson, Sarah experienced a frightening event. As they drove through a neighboring town looking for a place to eat, her father's Jeep suddenly jolted. Rick thought they might have hit a large stone, but upon inspection, they found a bullet hole in the rear of the vehicle. Frightened and confused, Susie made 2 phone calls. Oddly, her first call was to her son Andrew, not the police. She believed that a white Mustang had been following them from the ranch, assuming it was Andrew's car. However, this assumption changed after the Jeep was shot at. Susie's second call was to the police, and she filed a report about the incident. Sarah recalled suspecting Todd Cleveland at the time, but now she questioned why her mother had called Andrew first. It turned out that both Sarah and Andrew stood to inherit a $1 million insurance policy from their father. Additionally, the family home was valued at about $1,650,000, and there was around $100,000 in cash plus other assets left by Rick and Susie. Investigators considered Sarah's suspicions and eventually ruled out her former partner, Todd, as a suspect. Given the financial benefits and family tensions, the investigators continued to focus on the Wemsley children. However, DNA analysis and fingerprinting did not match any family members, indicating no direct connection to the crime scene for either Rick and Susie's son or daughter. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Sarah filed a petition to block Andrew from inheriting any family assets. She believed he was responsible for their parents' deaths and feared for her own safety. Although forensic examination of Andrew's car confirmed the presence of blood on the back seat and headrests, the Mustang had been thoroughly washed, making it impossible for experts to collect a viable DNA sample. Law enforcement couldn't even determine whose blood it was. Several months after Rick and Susie's tragic deaths, the investigation hit a dead end. The district attorney needed more information, so the police department convened a grand jury and began issuing subpoenas to those connected to the deceased couple. They started by verifying the alibis of the son and daughter. Jeremy Lavender, Chelsea's ex-boyfriend, testified under oath that Andrew and his friends were with him that night, providing a solid alibi. Chelsea's best friend Susanna corroborated this, and after giving her testimony, she voluntarily provided a DNA sample to compare with evidence from the crime scene. No one expected this moment would become a turning point in the investigation. Susanna Tadano had moved to Texas from Illinois a few years earlier. She didn't fit in well with her new classmates. She wasn't particularly diligent, smart, or charismatic. Susanna frequently skipped classes and argued with her mother. Chelsea Richardson became Susanna's lifeline, and the two grew so close that Chelsea wrote a note in the school yearbook celebrating their strong friendship and even composed a poem titled Friends Forever. When investigators compared Susanna Tadano's DNA with the strand of hair found in Rick's hand and DNA from the broken hair clip at the crime scene, they found a match. This revelation indicated there was much more to the story. Susanna was arrested on suspicion of killing the Wemsley couple and faced the possibility of the death penalty. Realizing the severity of her situation, Susanna began to talk. Initially, Susanna claimed that on the night of the crime, she was walking with a friend, a 25-year-old man named Hilario Cardes. She said Hilario had a gun and needed money. According to her story, Hilario entered the Wemsley house alone in the middle of the night while she stayed outside. When she heard gunshots, she ran into the house, where Rick Wemsley allegedly begged her to stop the attack. Susanna claimed she couldn't intervene because she wasn't really involved. Her hair was left in the house during the chaos. But who was Hilario Cardes? It turned out he worked as a night manager at a local restaurant where the friends frequently spent their leisure time. Hilario had a young daughter and was in desperate need of money. He learned about the Wemsley family's wealth through Andrew Wemsley, whom he had met and befriended. During questioning, Hilario denied any involvement in the attack, but admitted to acquiring a gun for $200 at Andrew Wemsley's request. Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna had planned to practice target shooting with an acquaintance. Armed investigators sought to verify Hilario's story, starting with the owners of the property where the teenagers supposedly practiced shooting. The property owner, a friend of Chelsea's mother, confirmed that a few months before the tragedy, Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna came to her approximately 3-acre plot to practice shooting at a small pond. However, she had never seen or heard of Hilario Cardes. Hilario further gained the police's trust by passing a lie detector test. The pond on the farm property was drained and forensic experts collected bullets from the bottom. They matched the bullets fired in the Wemsley house, confirming that the three teenagers had indeed been practicing their marksmanship for several months, preparing for the crime. This evidence discredited Susanna's initial story accusing Hilario of attacking the Wemsley couple. She was given another opportunity to tell the truth, and this time she directly implicated her best friend in a more detailed account. According to Susanna's new version, the three teenagers spent nights at a local cafe plotting their sinister plans. They calculated that, after Rick and Susie's deaths, Andrew would inherit over $1 million, a sum that would set them up for life. The friends envisioned living together, with Susanna quitting her hated low-paying job and buying a new car. They convinced Hilario to purchase a gun for them. After target practice on the farm, the group concluded that Susanna was the most accurate shooter among them. Their first plan involved shooting at Rick's Jeep's gas tank. If successful, this would have caused an explosion, potentially killing Rick and his family. However, the plan did not go as intended. The plan to eliminate the Wemsley family for financial gain started with an attempt to shoot at Rick's Jeep's gas tank. When that failed, the teenagers Andrew, Chelsea, and Susanna decided to break into the Wemsley house, intending to stage it as a robbery. Chelsea's frustration with Susanna led her to pressure Susanna into following through with the plan. Susanna, armed with a gun, was hidden in Andrew's bedroom closet. After several hours of indecision, she and the others proceeded with their plan early on December 11, 2003. Susanna shot Susie on the couch, then attempted to shoot Rick in the master bedroom, missing and waking him up. A struggle ensued, and Andrew took the gun from Susanna, delivering fatal shots to his father. Chelsea and Andrew then inflicted additional wounds on Rick before fleeing. Susanna's testimony, though initially inconsistent, became the cornerstone of the case against her friends. She confessed to her involvement and implicated Chelsea and Andrew in the crime. The investigation and subsequent trial revealed a complex web of deceit, manipulation, and betrayal among the teenagers. Chelsea Richardson, once seen as the mastermind, was convicted and sentenced to death. Her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment after her defense argued that her best friend, Susanna, was the primary instigator. Andrew Wemsley received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 2044, while Hilario Cardes, involved in the conspiracy but not the attack, was sentenced to 50 years. Susanna Tadano, who provided crucial testimony, was also convicted and will be eligible for parole in 2034. Story 4. Jessica Wongso was born in 1988 in Jakarta, Indonesia, into an exceptionally wealthy family. The youngest of 3 children, she was raised by her parents, Imelda and Winardi Wongso, in an environment of extreme luxury. Her family owned a major company specializing in plastic imports, making them one of the largest plastic distributors in Indonesia. Her father was even nicknamed the Plastic King. In a country where most people live on an average income of around $4 a day, Jessica belonged to the privileged few. She always had more than she needed and never lacked for anything. In 2005, Jessica's parents moved to Sydney, Australia, as it was a key market for their business. They purchased a beautiful home in Double Bay, one of Sydney's most exclusive residential areas, where even a small plot of land could cost millions. For more space, Jessica's father bought 2 adjacent plots. However, for reasons unknown, Jessica did not move to Australia with her parents and siblings. She stayed behind in Jakarta to complete her high school education, surrounded by a staff of servants who took care of her every need. From a young age, Jessica was passionate about video games and showed a natural talent for painting, often spending hours absorbed in drawing. This passion eventually led her to pursue a degree in graphic design. After graduating from high school in 2007, Jessica moved to Sydney to live with her family and enrolled at the Billy Blue College of Design. Although her siblings were also in Australia, they led separate lives and Jessica rarely saw them. As she started her university life, she made many friends. Her college friends described Jessica as a lively, silly girl who always entertained those around her with her humor and energy. It was during this time that Jessica met Myrna Salihin, another Indonesian student at the university. Like Jessica, Myrna also came from a wealthy family in Jakarta. Her father, Eddie Salihin, was a successful businessman. Myrna had a twin sister named Sandy and a long-term boyfriend, Aryav, who was studying in Melbourne while Myrna was in Sydney. Jessica and Myrna quickly became close friends, bonding over their shared backgrounds, love for design, and strong personalities. However, they also had their differences. While Jessica was outspoken and loved being the center of attention at every gathering, Myrna was shy, modest, and preferred a simpler, more low-key life. Moreover, unlike Jessica, Myrna's family was warm and close-knit. The university years were some of the most memorable for everyone. Jessica and Myrna often went out with 2 other classmates, Hani and Vera, who were also international students from wealthy families in Jakarta. Time passed and eventually graduation day arrived. After graduation, Myrna returned to Jakarta with her boyfriend, while Jessica chose to stay in Australia with her family. In June 2015, Myrna visited Sydney for a holiday. She planned to meet her university friends and spend some time exploring the beautiful harbor city. Reconnecting with Jessica, they arranged to have dinner together. For years had passed since their graduation, and they had each gone their separate ways. While Myrna enjoyed a fulfilling life with her fiancé, they were newly engaged and planning their dream wedding. Jessica's life was less smooth. She was working in New South Wales and had a long-term boyfriend named Patrick, but their relationship was troubled by frequent arguments. Jessica confided that Patrick used prohibited substances and was prone to violence. She seemed to be struggling with mental health issues, becoming increasingly depressed and negative. The cheerful, lively Jessica from university was no longer there, and Myrna grew concerned for her friend. Being straightforward by nature, Myrna advised Jessica to break up with Patrick. It was clear from Jessica's stories that Patrick was not good for her and was having a detrimental effect on her well-being. However, Myrna could never have anticipated Jessica's reaction. Jessica became silent, offering no response to Myrna's advice. When Myrna finished speaking, Jessica abruptly stood up from the dining table and left the restaurant without saying goodbye. That day, Myrna learned a valuable lesson. Never advise someone on whether to marry or divorce. The friendship between Myrna and Jessica, already strained since graduation, now seemed beyond repair. Myrna told Arif that she would only meet Jessica if other friends were present. Myrna felt uneasy about seeing Jessica alone, but Arif reassured her not to overthink it. After all, Jessica was in Sydney and they were in Jakarta. They no longer had many mutual friends and life had moved on. In November 2015, just 5 months after the awkward encounter with Jessica, Myrna and Arif celebrated their fairy tale wedding in Bali. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with friends and family, but notably, Jessica was not among the guests. Myrna, admired for her beauty, intelligence, and wealth, seemed to have it all. A loving husband and a life that appeared picture-perfect. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Jessica's life was unraveling. In August 2015, she crashed her Audi A3 into a nursing home at 2 a.m. while intoxicated. The car plowed through a brick wall, stopping just inches from the elderly residents' sleeping quarters. Thankfully, no one was injured, but the accident caused chaos and woke everyone in the home. Jessica sustained only minor injuries, but her car was heavily damaged. This wasn't the first time in 2015 that Jessica had found herself in an ambulance. Over the course of the year, she had been hospitalized 5 times, struggling with a deep desire to end her life. Police and emergency services were frequent visitors to Jessica's home, often arriving just in time to prevent another tragedy. But by November, her boyfriend Patrick had reached his limit. He sought a restraining order to keep Jessica away, exhausted by her relentless harassment. Thousands of threatening messages, including promises to kill them both if he left her. Jessica also harassed Patrick's friends and family, leaving them all deeply concerned for their safety. Jessica's life continued to spiral as she drowned herself in alcohol and engaged in increasingly reckless behavior, which eventually cost her her job. Furious and feeling like she had nothing left, Jessica began to lash out. She sent threatening messages to her former manager, detailing how she could kill both the manager and the manager's mother. With her life in Sydney in ruins, no job, no relationship, and no stability, Jessica decided to return to Jakarta. To those around her, it seemed like she wanted to start fresh. But her decision was driven by something far darker. In early December 2015, Jessica created a WhatsApp group with Hani and Myrna, 2 of her old university friends. Hani was also living in Jakarta. Although Myrna was still upset and hadn't spoken to Jessica since their last encounter, Jessica's return to Jakarta set events in motion that no one could have anticipated. Myrna didn't respond to Jessica's messages right away. However, after Jessica's persistent pleas and with Hani's involvement, Myrna reluctantly agreed to meet. Jessica eagerly messaged the group, saying she would take care of the reservations and treat them to drinks. She even asked what everyone wanted to order. Myrna mentioned she liked Vietnamese iced coffee, but said she would order it herself when she arrived. They planned to meet at 5 p.m. on Wednesday, January 6, 2016 at Oliver Coffee, a luxurious cafe in the Grand Indonesia Shopping Center. On the day of the meeting, Jessica arrived at 3:30 p.m., a full 90 minutes early. She spent some time wandering around, seemingly taking in her surroundings. In reality, Jessica was carefully observing the placement of the cafe's cameras. Eventually, she chose table number 54, a secluded spot by the wall out of direct view. By 4:15 p.m., Jessica returned with 3 shopping bags from the body shop. She mentioned she had bought 3 bars of soap as gifts for her friends. Placing the bags on the table, Jessica subtly adjusted them to block the camera's view. Soon after, she approached the bar and ordered 3 drinks, 2 cocktails, and 1 Vietnamese iced coffee, paying for them in advance. When the server brought the drinks, Jessica ensured they were placed behind the shopping bags. After the server left, Jessica shifted her seat. Although the camera footage was blurry, her hand movements were noticeable. It appeared she was adding something to the coffee. Once she was done, Jessica stashed the bags behind her chair and returned to her seat. Myrna and Hani arrived at the cafe at 5:15 p.m., 15 minutes later than planned. By that time, their drinks had been sitting on the table for over 45 minutes. Jessica stood up to greet them as they approached. Myrna's body language indicated discomfort and awkwardness around Jessica. As they sat down, Myrna between Jessica and Hani, Jessica quickly urged Myrna to try the coffee. Unaware of what was to come, Myrna took a sip. Almost immediately, she knew something was wrong. She waved her hands frantically, telling Hani that the coffee tasted terrible. Though she barely touched the drink, that single sip was enough to seal Myrna's fate. Less than a minute later, Myrna's head snapped back in what would be her final movement. She began to vomit, foam at the mouth, and convulse before collapsing to the ground, all within minutes. Chaos ensued. Servers and the manager quickly came over to help while Hani desperately tried to wake Myrna, who was completely unconscious. The manager told the staff to call an ambulance and bring oxygen tanks. As other customers watched in shock, Hani screamed and cried uncontrollably. Only Jessica stayed eerily calm and emotionless. Later, the restaurant manager told the police that she first thought Myrna was having an epileptic seizure, but Jessica immediately glared at her and accused, "What did you guys put in the coffee?" The manager, confused and offended, wondered why Jessica would blame them for tampering with the drink. Jessica's accusation made the manager suspicious, so she told the staff to seal the coffee cup as evidence. If Jessica hadn't spoken up, this key piece of evidence might have been thrown away. Meanwhile, Hani called Arif, telling him that Myrna was having a seizure and foaming at the mouth. Arif was filled with panic and rushed to the hospital, but by the time he arrived, Myrna had passed away. The doctors did everything they could, but it was too late. Arif was heartbroken. Just 2 months after their wedding, his future with Myrna was gone. Myrna Salahin died at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, January 6, 2016. Her family and friends were in shock, struggling to understand how a healthy young woman could suddenly die. Just 2 months earlier, they had celebrated her wedding, and now they were gathered around her coffin in grief. The suddenness of her death, along with the strange circumstances, immediately raised suspicions. At the funeral, Jessica's strange behavior stood out. She seemed irritated and didn't shed a single tear, which made people wonder even more. Why had she insisted that Myrna drink the coffee? Why had she ordered it 45 minutes before they arrived? Why choose a table hidden from one camera's view and blocked by the shopping bags from another? Sadly, everything happened so quickly that no one thought to search Jessica that day. Security footage showed that while everyone else was panicking and trying to help Myrna, Jessica stood off to the side, looking around and scratching her thigh. Experts later guessed that the itching on Jessica's hand might have been caused by contact with cyanide. When asked to hand over her trousers for testing, Jessica claimed she had thrown them away because Myrna had vomited on them. But in reality, Jessica never went near Myrna after the poisoning. She just stood back, showing no emotion, and did nothing to help. It's hard to believe that a friend, a young woman like Jessica, could be capable of such a terrible act. But her cold, distant behavior and suspicious actions left many wondering what she was really capable of. The manager handed Myrna's coffee to the police for investigation. 3 days later, the test results came back. The police confirmed that the coffee contained a deadly amount of cyanide. In Indonesia, where most people are Muslim, religious beliefs often discourage autopsies. In criminal cases, the police need the family's permission to perform one. At first, Myrna's family was hesitant to allow the autopsy because they didn't want her body to be disturbed. However, the investigators worked hard to convince the family, promising that the procedure would be done with great care. Eventually, the family agreed to let the police take some samples, but they did not allow a full autopsy. On the evening of Saturday, January 9th, 3 days after Myrna's death, the autopsy was conducted, and the findings were completed by the next morning. The results showed that Myrna's stomach had bled and contained a small amount of cyanide. However, the toxicology tests found no cyanide in other parts of her body. Thanks to the manager's smart decision to have the staff seal the coffee cup, the police had solid evidence. The murder weapon was a coffee cup laced with cyanide. The question then arose: how did Jessica get cyanide? Acquiring cyanide legally is difficult, but many believe that Jessica, being smart, might have bought it on the black market. However, the police found no evidence that Jessica had ever obtained cyanide. The case shook the entire nation of Indonesia, drawing massive public interest and media attention. People followed the case closely, discussing it as if it were a crime thriller. From that point on, many rumors began to spread. After security camera footage quickly circulated on social media, most people suspected Jessica. But the big question remained. Why? What was her motive? Some speculated that Jessica had unrequited feelings for Myrna and decided to seek revenge after learning that Myrna had married Ariev. Others suggested Jessica acted out of anger because she wasn't invited to the wedding and felt left out as Myrna became closer to Hani and Vera. Ariev, Myrna's husband, thought that Jessica was upset because Myrna had advised her to break up with her boyfriend. Meanwhile, Sandy, Myrna's sister, believed that Jessica killed Myrna out of jealousy. She envied everything Myrna had that she didn't. Not just wealth, but also a loving husband, a happy family, and close friends in Jakarta. However, all of these were just speculations. The true motive behind Jessica's actions might only be known to her. Indonesian police contacted the Australian authorities to access Jessica's criminal record while she lived in Australia. Since Australia has laws against the death penalty, the police agreed to share the files on the condition that Jessica would not face the death penalty if found guilty. The Indonesian authorities agreed, and it turned out that Jessica's record in Australia was far from clean. She was mentioned in 13 police reports for offenses like threatening others, driving under the influence, and even having her ex-boyfriend file a restraining order against her. On June 15, 2016, 6 months after Myrna's death, the trial of the century began at the Central Jakarta Court. Jessica showed no signs of guilt or sadness. In fact, she was quite the opposite. If you only looked at the footage, you might think she had just won a jackpot rather than being on trial for murder. Jessica appeared glowing, smiling throughout the session, and even waved proudly at the press. It was clear she enjoyed being in the spotlight. During the trial, she kept a calm demeanor, often smiling at the judge and looking confident that she would be acquitted. Her wealthy family hired over 15 of Indonesia's top lawyers to defend her. The defense argued that no cyanide was found in Myrna's liver, lungs, or urine. Only a small amount was detected in her stomach, which they suggested could have been naturally produced after death. They also claimed that a full autopsy was needed to determine the exact cause of death, while the examiners had only studied tissue and fluid samples. Jessica's lawyers even suggested Myrna's death could have been from an undiagnosed illness. The police, however, never proved that Jessica possessed cyanide. On October 5, 2016, the packed courtroom and the entire nation held their breath as the final verdict was read. Jessica was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The courtroom erupted in applause and sighs of relief. Due to an agreement with Australian authorities, Jessica avoided the death penalty by firing squad. For many Indonesians watching the lives of the ultra-wealthy like Jessica and Myrna, this case highlighted that even the rich face their own troubles and unhappiness. Afterward, Vietnamese iced coffee became a popular drink in cafes across the city, though it carried a dark association that no one really wanted to talk about. Story 5. We're diving into a chilling case about someone who caused a bloodbath in a peaceful town. When a crime happens in a small, quiet place where everyone knows each other, it quickly becomes the talk of the town. But if it's a brutal attack on an entire family, something that's never happened before, it doesn't just get people talking, it leads to rumors, speculations, and gruesome stories that eventually become an urban legend. This tragic event took place in the fall of 2010, in a small Australian town called Kapunda, with a population of only 3,000. It's located near the Light River and Barossa Valley in South Australia. The whole town was shocked by the horrific news of a family being massacred. The local police, who had never seen anything like this, were left baffled. Rumors quickly spread, and the story was told in many different ways. Things got so out of control that the police had to partially classify the case to avoid further panic and prevent leaks. The family involved was well known and respected in the town. They had no known enemies, and there seemed to be no clear motive for the crime. At first, it appeared to be a senseless act of violence, leading detectives to believe it might have been the work of a madman. Surprisingly, the real culprit wasn't even considered a suspect at first, and might have gotten away with it if he hadn't accidentally revealed himself later on. Let's talk about the Rowe family. The head of the family, Andrew Rowe, was born in England in 1965. When he was just 3 years old, he and his parents moved to Australia, where they decided to stay. They settled in a suburb of Adelaide, and Andrew grew up there, attending school. He was known to be friendly, had a great sense of humor, made lots of friends, and enjoyed fishing with his dad. After high school, while studying in Adelaide, Andrew met Rose, a cheerful young woman just a year younger than him. The two quickly developed a romantic relationship, and in 1985, they got married in a small ceremony with only close friends and family. 2 years later, in 1987, they had their first child, a boy named Christopher. In 1994, Andrew and Rose Rowe welcomed their second child, a daughter named Chantel. The family settled in the quiet town of Kapunda and started their own carpet cleaning business. The business thrived, giving them financial stability. Their children attended local schools, where both performed well academically. Christopher, their eldest son, took up guitar and became interested in music, while Chantel excelled in painting, danced, and played basketball. She was known for being kind-hearted and always willing to help others. Chantel dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and Christopher planned to pursue a career in programming and technology. The Rowe family was close-knit and happy. By the summer of 2010, 23-year-old Christopher had moved out to live with his girlfriend, just a few blocks away. In September, 16-year-old Chantel started working part-time as a waitress at a roadside cafe. Since she didn't have her driver's license yet, her father or brother would drive her to work, though she looked forward to getting her own license soon. The crime scene was so horrifying that even seasoned detectives from Adelaide were shocked. Inside the house, it looked like a scene from a horror movie, with blood splattered everywhere on the floor, walls, furniture, curtains, and even the ceiling. The bodies of 45-year-old Andrew and 44-year-old Rose were found in the kitchen, severely disfigured, while Chantel's body lay in her bedroom, brutally torn. Each family member had suffered multiple stab wounds and had been dead long before the police and paramedics arrived. Detectives quickly suspected that the crime was personal, as nothing was stolen. Valuables like phones, a laptop, an expensive camera, and even money were left in plain sight. This suggested that the killer wasn't motivated by robbery. The brutality also hinted that more than one person might have been involved, as it would have been difficult for a single individual to overpower 3 adults. Alternatively, the perpetrator could have been a physically strong man. Investigators noticed that someone had clumsily tried to clean the crime scene, wiping away footprints in some areas, but the attempt was abandoned. Bloody shoe prints were also found leading to the door, but they suddenly stopped, implying the killer might have removed his shoes and left in socks. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested that the family had likely known the killer and willingly let him inside, or he had entered through some other means. The family had no known enemies, leaving everyone puzzled as to who could have committed such a horrific crime. Some clear fingerprints were found on the door to Chantel's room, but they didn't match anyone in the police database, indicating that the person responsible had never been caught for any previous crimes. The house was immediately sealed off as a crime scene, and the surrounding area was fenced off to keep away curious onlookers and the press, who had quickly gathered at the scene. To avoid scaring the killer into hiding or fleeing, the police chose not to release too many details about the investigation. Still, rumors of a maniac spread quickly through the small town. People became fearful, avoiding the streets at night and locking their doors tightly. As strange as it sounds, the first person suspected of the crime was Christopher, the only surviving family member. At the time of the murders, He was on vacation with his fiancée in Moreton Bay, Queensland, on the Pacific coast. However, authorities had to investigate all possibilities, no matter how unlikely they seemed. Christopher was the first to raise the alarm when he couldn't get in touch with his family, and he took the next flight home after hearing the devastating news. His alibi and fingerprints were quickly checked, and it was confirmed that he was on the other side of the continent at the time of the crime, so he was ruled out as a suspect. A strange detail emerged from the investigation after the murders. The killer changed into clean clothes and lay on the bed. Bloody drag marks near Chantil's bed indicated that she had likely tried to hide under it, but the killer had pulled her out. Forensic experts also determined that she had been sexually assaulted before her death. This further suggested that the crime was deeply personal, filled with senseless cruelty. Andrew, the head of the family, suffered over 30 stab wounds while Rose was stabbed 50 times. Evidence showed she had been attacked twice and had even tried to call for help after the first attack. Chantil had 33 stab wounds and had been sexually assaulted. Investigators immediately looked into Chantil's personal life, focusing on whether she had been in a relationship or had any obsessive admirers. It was soon revealed that she had been dating a boy named Dylan for about a year. They both attended the same school, and at 16 years old, Dylan didn't initially seem capable of committing such a brutal crime. Nonetheless, detectives needed to interview him, check his alibi, and hear his thoughts on whether anyone might have wanted to harm Chantil or her family. Dylan cooperated fully with the police, expressing his deep grief over Chantil's death. He explained that they had a loving relationship and planned to marry once they were older. He was devastated by her loss and didn't know how to cope. At the time of the murders, Dylan had been in a nearby city attending his grandfather's anniversary. His alibi was confirmed by dozens of witnesses, and he was ruled out as a suspect. The police had few leads but now had the killer's fingerprints, as well as DNA from the seminal fluid found on Chantil's body. This gave them a crucial piece of evidence that could eventually help them identify the murderer. The DNA extracted from the seminal fluid and fingerprints left at the scene did not match anyone in the police database, adding to the mystery. Interestingly, the family was killed with knives from their own kitchen, suggesting that the attack may not have been premeditated, but rather a spontaneous act of violence. The killer took the murder weapons with him when he left the house. Forensic experts determined the time of death to be between midnight and 2 a.m. A neighbor of the Rowe family reported hearing Rose call for help twice around 1 a.m., followed by a loud thud, but assumed it was a domestic dispute and did not call the police. No strangers were seen near the house that night, and officers meticulously searched the area for any clues or the missing murder weapons. The police also reached out to the local community through the media, asking for any information that could help with the investigation. However, this led to an overwhelming number of tips, many of which were unhelpful or false. People called in to report suspicious individuals, strange cars, and even tried to link the crime to local biker gangs or drug dealers. There were also tips about social media posts from local residents, but none of these leads advanced the investigation. 2 days before the murders, detectives discovered Chantal's expensive camera at the crime scene. Since Chantal was an avid photographer, they hoped the camera might contain useful images. Indeed, they found many pictures, and the most recent ones drew their attention. On November 6th, just 2 days before the massacre, Chantal had hosted a small gathering at her home. Her parents had gone to stay with relatives for the night, so she took advantage of their absence to invite her boyfriend and 3 close friends, along with their partners, for a quiet evening of movie watching and a barbecue. It wasn't a wild party, just a calm, friendly get-together. Chantal took numerous photos that night, capturing everyone enjoying themselves. Some of the guests even posted pictures from the evening on their social media pages, which the police examined for any potential clues. All of Chantal's friends who attended the party stayed overnight at the row house and left the next morning, with Andrew and Rose even cooking breakfast for everyone. Detectives realized it was crucial to interview everyone who had been at the party to see if Chantal had any enemies, envious peers, or stalkers. They also decided to collect fingerprints from each person to compare them with the prints found on Chantal's bedroom door. Chantal's friends were still in shock over the murders, but fully cooperated with the investigation. They came to the station to testify, provided their fingerprints and DNA samples, which didn't match the ones found at the crime scene, and allowed the police to access their social media accounts and phones. They recounted the events of what ended up being the last party at the row house. Dylan recalled that on Sunday, Chantal wasn't feeling well and likely had a cold. By the evening, she had developed a fever and called her boss to let him know she wouldn't be able to work the next day. The following morning, at around 5 a.m., Dylan texted her to ask how she was feeling. He saw that his message had been read, but Chantal never responded. What Dylan didn't know at the time was that Chantal and her parents were already dead, and the killer had read his message. In a chilling detail, the police discovered that the killer had even tried to respond to Dylan's text, but Chantal's phone account had run out of credit, so the message was never sent. The killer had attempted to create the illusion that Chantal was still alive. Dylan, along with several of Chantal's closest friends, helped the police compile a list of everyone she had been in contact with. Law enforcement systematically worked their way down the list, questioning and checking each person. About a week into the investigation, they reached an 18-year-old named Jason Downey, who had previously attended the same high school as Chantal and Dylan. He had graduated the previous year and was now working at a local auto repair shop. Initially, Jason didn't raise any red flags. He was of average height, very thin, and appeared completely harmless. The plan was to ask him a few questions and then let him go. However, during the interview, Jason began to act strangely. Instead of answering the detective's standard questions directly, he became increasingly nervous and his behavior started to raise suspicions. On November 4, 2010, Christopher left for a vacation to Brisbane with his girlfriend, intending to return and prepare for their upcoming wedding. However, on November 8th, Christopher couldn't reach his family and grew increasingly concerned. After learning from his father's office that Andrew hadn't shown up for work, Christopher sensed something was wrong. He asked a friend to check on the house. Around 3 p.m. that day, a patrol car arrived at the row home. When the local police, who were unprepared for such a crime, saw the horrific scene inside, they immediately requested backup, realizing they were dealing with a brutal triple murder. Jason Downey began acting oddly during the police interview. He complained about not being invited to Chantal's party, mentioning that everyone else had a partner and he didn't have a girlfriend. Then, out of nowhere, he claimed to have an alibi for the night of the murders, even though no one had asked about it yet. His odd behavior made the police even more suspicious. As a result, they decided to fully investigate him, including taking his fingerprints and DNA sample. Surprisingly, Downey remained calm and cooperative, agreeing to all the tests without showing any nervousness. This behavior caused the police to briefly doubt their suspicions, but they continued with the procedures. When an expert collected his fingerprints, he noticed fresh, deep cuts on Jason's palms. Downey explained that he had hurt himself while working at the machine shop, but the cuts looked as if they had been made by a thin, sharp object. When the fingerprint results came back, they showed that Downey's prints matched the ones found on Chantal's bedroom door. All that remained was to wait for the DNA results, which would due in 2 days. The police questioned Downey again, asking how his fingerprints ended up in the Rowe family house if he hadn't been there recently. Downey calmly explained that he had visited the house with Dylan about a month and a half earlier, suggesting that's when he might have left the prints. However, this explanation didn't hold up as the prints were fresh and clean, not old or faded. On November 16, 2010, the DNA results came in, confirming that Jason Downey had assaulted Chantal that night and was responsible for the murders of her and her parents. But the question remained, why had he done it? And how did this skinny young man find the strength and rage to commit such a brutal act? Jason was arrested that same day. Now, the detectives needed to uncover the motive behind this horrific massacre. Who was Jason Downey? Jason Downey was born in September 1992 in the Scottish town of Kilmarnock, where he spent his childhood and early teen years. He was the youngest of 2 children and was raised alongside his older brother, Jamie. When Jason was just 8 months old, his parents divorced and his mother, Lorraine, took on the role of raising him. His father remarried soon after, and Jason and Jamie had a half-sister named Judy, though they had little contact with her. When Jason was 13, he, his mother, and his brother emigrated to Australia, where they settled in the small town of Kapunda. In their new home, Jason's mother remarried, this time to a local resident. Jason Downey had a difficult time adjusting to life in the small town of Kapunda after growing up in a big city. He despised the quiet, provincial atmosphere and longed to leave. At school, Jason struggled socially. His peers found him strange, and most only spoke to him out of pity. He was overly talkative, arrogant, and frequently lied, boasting about his imaginary athletic abilities, popularity, and supposed admirers. In reality, girls ignored him and his odd behavior repelled others. Dylan, Chantal's boyfriend, played on the same basketball team as Jason and felt sorry for him. Out of kindness, Dylan started inviting Jason to friendly gatherings and even introduced him to Chantal, a decision that would have disastrous consequences. Chantal, who was polite and empathetic, treated Jason kindly, and she had even defended him from other teenagers on occasion. Her friendly demeanor, however, led Jason to develop an intense crush on her, which soon turned into an unhealthy obsession. Jason began to believe that Chantal harbored secret feelings for him, but couldn't express them because of her relationship with Dylan. Although Chantal never encouraged Jason's advances or gave him any reason to hope, he misinterpreted her kindness. Over time, his infatuation morphed into a delusional fantasy in which he believed that he and Chantal were meant to be together. Jason became consumed by these thoughts, mistaking her politeness for love, while no one around him noticed the depth of his obsession. Once the police were certain that Jason was responsible for the murders, they knew they had to act quickly to arrest him. However, they were unsure of how best to proceed, fearing that Jason could pose a danger to himself or others. To avoid any potential complications, they decided to lure him to the police station under a benign pretext. When Jason arrived, he was immediately placed in handcuffs, but surprisingly, he showed no emotion. He wasn't startled, scared, or angry. He remained completely calm. During his first interrogation, Jason denied all accusations. He tried to explain away the evidence, claiming that he had left his fingerprints in the Rowe family home during his previous visit a month and a half earlier. When questioned about how his DNA was found on Chantal's body, Jason made a desperate claim. He said that during that same visit, he and Chantal had consensual intimacy. However, this story was easily disproven. The forensic evidence made it clear that the seminal fluid found on Chantal's body could not have remained there for such a long period, either inside or outside her body. This false narrative further exposed Jason's lies and guilt. Jason Downey's confession revealed a disturbing sequence of events that led to the brutal murders of Chantal and her parents. After an argument with his mother and stepfather, Jason claimed he decided to sleep in his car. However, after speaking with Dylan, who mentioned Chantal was sick and staying home, Jason became obsessed with seeing her. His initial plan was simply to drive by her house and look through the windows, something he had done many times before due to his fixation on her. When Jason arrived at the Rowe family's home, it was dark inside, so he parked his car at the end of the street and returned on foot. He found a small bathroom window left open, and being thin, he was able to squeeze through it without much difficulty. Once inside, Jason sat quietly in the bathroom for about half an hour, listening to ensure that everyone in the house had gone to bed. Jason later claimed that his intention was to confess his feelings to Chantal. However, he took a knife from the kitchen before entering her bedroom, a fact he could not explain logically. Investigators believe that Jason had more sinister intentions from the beginning, likely planning to use the knife to threaten and control Chantal in order to fulfill his obsessive desires. When Jason entered Chantal's room and attempted to assault her, she resisted. This resistance triggered a violent rage in Jason, leading him to stab her repeatedly. The horrific attack woke her parents, Andrew and Rose, who rushed to help their daughter. However, Jason, now in a frenzied state, turned his knife on them as well, brutally stabbing both Andrew and Rose to death. In his confession, Jason claimed he acted out of an uncontrollable passion, but the calculated nature of his actions sneaking into the house, bringing a weapon, and murdering not just Chantal but her parents suggested otherwise. His confession did little to minimize his guilt, despite his attempts to downplay his responsibility. As the investigation progressed, more damning evidence against Jason surfaced. A pair of bloodstained shoes was found discarded in a deserted area, and the blood on them matched that of all 3 victims. The sole prints from these shoes matched the bloody footprints found at the crime scene, and inside the shoes were traces of Jason's sweat, further implicating him. Despite Jason's attempts to cooperate with investigators, promising, for example, to show them where he had disposed of the knives used in the murders, the murder weapons were never recovered, leading detectives to suspect that he was still trying to manipulate the situation. Jason's confession did help reconstruct the timeline of events, but it did little to change the gruesome reality of his crime. His obsession with Chantal, combined with his inability to control his urges, had driven him to commit an unimaginable act of violence, wiping out an entire family in the process. The trial of Jason Downey concluded with a sentence that echoed the severity of his crimes. In the fall of 2011, nearly a year after the brutal murders of Chantal Rowe and her parents, Jason stood trial. Throughout the proceedings, he remained emotionless, often changing his testimony and showing no remorse for his actions. He continued to claim that he had no memory of killing the Rowe family and insisted that he had loved Chantal, even though his actions told a much darker story. One detail that stood out during the trial was that after the massacre, Jason had taken Chantal's pendant and chain, which were later found during a search of his room and car. This act underscored his obsession with her, as he tried to keep a piece of her with him even after her death. Despite his claim that the tragedy could have been avoided if Chantal had invited him to the party she hosted before her death, it was clear that his feelings of rejection and obsession had driven him to commit the horrific act. Throughout the trial, Jason maintained a calm and indifferent demeanor. He ultimately pleaded guilty, hoping for a lighter sentence. He openly admitted to his brother that this was the reason for his guilty plea to avoid life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the end, on April 19, 2012, Jason Downey was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Had he not pleaded guilty, he would have had to serve at least 45 years before being eligible for parole. Chantal's brother, Christopher Rowe, who lost his entire family in the massacre, expressed that while he believed the punishment was just, no court sentence could ever heal the pain of losing his loved ones. In memory of his parents and sister, Christopher had their names tattooed on his body. Despite the grief and tragedy, Christopher has since found a way to rebuild his life. He is now married and raising his son, Kobe, honoring the memory of his family while moving forward with his own. The case left an indelible mark on all involved, with Jason Downey's lack of remorse and cold demeanor continuing to haunt those who followed the trial. Story 6. The Spokane Police Department announced it has identified the man who killed 9-year-old Candy Rogers in 1959. It was possibly the most well-known cold case in the city and the entire state. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, 9-year-old Candy Rogers left her home in West Central Spokane to sell campfire mints in her neighborhood and nearby areas. As hours passed with no sign of her return, her family grew increasingly worried, fearing the worst. Then, after 2 weeks of intense searching, a devastating discovery was made. Her lifeless body was found deep in the heart of the dense woods, far from her home. Despite extensive efforts by detectives, the mystery surrounding her death remained unsolved for decades. However, over 60 years later, the truth emerged. So, what happened to Candy? Did she become lost in the woods and fall victim to a wild animal? Or was her fate even more tragic? Now, we explore one of the oldest cold cases ever solved, the story of Candy Rogers. But before we begin, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. Now, let's delve into this mystery. Today, we're heading to Spokane, a city nestled in the state of Washington, USA. Known for its vibrant cultural scene and stunning natural landscapes, Spokane attracts many outdoor enthusiasts. The Spokane River flows through its heart, offering a lively downtown area filled with numerous shopping, dining, and entertainment options. Additionally, Spokane holds significance as the birthplace of Father's Day and hosts the annual Lilac Festival, celebrating the city's iconic flower. Born in 1950 to Elaine and Carl Rogers, Candy was their only child, cherished deeply by her parents. Despite Elaine and Carl's marriage ending in divorce at some point, Candy remained under her mother's care. Elaine, a schoolteacher at the time, ensured she provided for Candy to the best of her ability. Candy was well-liked in her neighborhood, known for her cheerful demeanor and friendly nature. By 1959, at the age of 9, Candy attended Holmes Elementary School as a fourth grader. Like many girls her age, Candy was a member of the Bluebirds, a youth organization affiliated with the Campfire Girls. The Bluebirds aimed to offer girls opportunities for learning, recreation, and a connection to nature, fostering personal development and independence. Candy actively participated in the group's activities, which included camping, community service, hiking, and more. She approached each activity with enthusiasm and joy. Candy was growing up to be a bright and happy girl, evident to everyone around her. However, no one anticipated the tragic event that would soon disrupt her life and deeply affect the entire community. On March 6, 1959, after coming back from school, Candy headed home to her mother. It was a Friday and she anticipated spending time with friends the next day. However, she had another task in mind. The Bluebirds were fundraising for an upcoming event and members needed to sell chocolates in the neighborhood. Candy had 7 boxes of campfire mints to sell that day. She sought permission from her mother, Elaine, who granted it with a reminder not to stay out too long and to return before dark. Although Candy always followed this rule, Elaine made sure to emphasize it each time Candy left the house. If Elaine had known that day would be different, she would have stopped her daughter from leaving. Candy quickly snacked on an oatmeal cookie and played briefly with the family dog before taking the boxes of campfire mints and leaving the house. It was around 4 p.m. Several girls around Candy's age were going door to door selling chocolate that unfortunate afternoon, and Candy joined them. What happened afterward remains unknown, but Candy never made it back home. By about 5:30 p.m., Elaine started feeling uneasy. It was unusual for Candy to be out so late. Each passing minute felt like an eternity to Elaine as she strained to hear Candy's familiar footsteps nearing the house, but they never came. Anxiety surged by 6 p.m. and Elaine was convinced that something was amiss. She quickly informed Candy's grandfather, Stanley Newton, about the situation. Other relatives, friends and neighbors were also alerted about Candy's absence, and by 6:30 p.m. a small group had mobilized to search for her. They began by asking people in the neighborhood if they had seen her, and some confirmed spotting her earlier carrying the boxes of campfire mints she was selling. However, no one knew her current whereabouts. Around 7 p.m., Candy's grandfather Newton and their friends narrowly avoided being hit by a fast-moving car, managing to move out of harm's way just in time. The scary incident left them feeling shaken, but they quickly refocused their efforts on finding Candy. As the sky grew darker, they continued searching despite the fading light, holding on to hope that Candy would be found safe before nightfall. Eventually, the authorities were notified about the missing girl, leading police officers and sheriff's deputies to join the search. By around 9 p.m. on the same day, a group of searchers found several boxes of campfire mints scattered across Paddock Drive. Many believed these boxes to be the ones Candy had been selling. Although they found 6 boxes that night, one was still missing. Despite their thorough search, there was no sign of Candy. Elaine found it hard to sleep as she worried about her daughter's safety. She prayed silently for Candy's return home, but the uncertainty was just too much to bear. The following morning was a Saturday, and by then almost everyone in the city had gotten the news that Candy was missing. Well-meaning individuals trooped out in large numbers to begin the search for the day. Officers rode on horseback as well as in vehicles to conduct the search. They looked through the woods and along major roads. The Air Force also assisted in the search by providing a helicopter. The aircraft was boarded by 4 trained personnel as well as 1 pilot, and they took it to the air. While flying over Spokane River, the pilot failed to see a high-tension wire until the last moment and ended up flying into it. The effect was immediate. The helicopter spiraled out of control and crashed into the Spokane River, instantly killing 3 of the 5 men on board. Airman Melissa D. Ray, Sergeant William A. McDonnell and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Faitche were the three men who tragically lost their lives on that day. Everyone who had joined in the search for Candy was saddened by the tragic event, but it did little to discourage them from searching for her. They remained determined and therefore intensified their efforts. None of them wanted the death of the three heroes to be in vain. But despite everyone's best efforts, they had no luck locating Candy for several days. It was as if she had simply vanished without a trace. With each passing day that Candy remained missing, Elaine began to look like a shadow of herself. She refused to touch her meals and would constantly stare into space. Not knowing the whereabouts of her only daughter was slowly driving her insane. The burden on her heart was just too much to bear. March 22, 1956 made it 16 days that Candy had been missing, and it was the day she was found. That afternoon, two airmen named Howard Lawrence and Richard Bergen were out hunting woodchucks in a wooded area about 7 miles away from Candy's home. Upon getting to a small clearing in the forest, they noticed a small pair of blue suede shoes. The delicate craftsmanship of the shoes and the small size indicated that they belonged to a child. They were baffled and wondered how the shoes had gotten there so far away from town. After looking around and waiting a while to see if anyone would come out to lay claim to the shoes, they picked them up and made their way back to base. The two men could not stop talking about the discovery they made in the woods, and the news soon spread like wildfire. The shoes were handed over to the police, who contacted Candy's grandfather to see if he could identify them. They had a strong suspicion that the shoes belonged to the little girl they had spent several days searching for. When Candy's grandfather saw the shoes, he told the police officers that they indeed looked similar to the ones she had worn in the past. With this confirmation, officers decided to focus their search on the area where the shoes had been found. Since it had grown dark, conducting a search would be difficult that night, and so they agreed to wait until the next morning. The following day was a Sunday, and by dawn a team of officers and volunteers had arrived at the clearing where the shoes had been found. They immediately began looking through the area, but initially found nothing. After some time went by, one of the officers suddenly came across a small mound made up of brush and pine needles. He found it strange and decided to take a closer look. To his horror, it did not take him long to see a knee sticking out from under the pile, and he carefully brushed away the leaves to reveal the decomposing body of a child. He instantly recognized her as the little girl they had been looking for. The clothes she was wearing were torn in places, and when the officer looked at her feet, he noticed that they were bound. A torn strip of cloth had been used to do this. Also wrapped around her neck was another strip of clothing. The officer quickly alerted the other searchers, and soon after the body was taken out of the area for an autopsy. Candy's relatives were immediately contacted and informed about the state in which she was found. Upon hearing that her daughter was dead, Elaine lost consciousness and had to be placed under sedation. More than 1,000 searchers who had volunteered their time, resources, and energy to look for Candy were shocked by the news. There was a general feeling of dread in the air, and from that moment many people began to fear for their safety as well as their children's. The result of the autopsy that was conducted on Candy's body revealed that she had been abused and then strangled to death. Detectives from the Spokane Police Department immediately began an investigation to find out who the culprit was. "We'll put every available man on the case and keep them there till the thing is solved," Police Chief Clifford Payne had told the media at the time. "We know what we're looking for now, we're looking for a maniac," he added. A lot of individuals were questioned, but detectives were unable to get any helpful information. The first person the authorities suspected of committing the crime was an imprisoned serial killer by the name of Hugh Byron Morse, and they had good reason for believing that he had something to do with it. When the autopsy was conducted on Candy's body, a strange purple smear that smelled like grape gum had been noticed on her clothes, and Morse was known for having a special liking for grape gum. But when he was asked about Candy's murder, he denied any involvement in it. Since there was no evidence to show that he was the killer they were looking for, charges could not be brought up against him. However, he remained a prime suspect in the case for a long time. Apart from him, detectives also investigated several tips that poured in after Candy's death, but none of them proved to be of any use. Candy was eventually laid to rest, and her devastated family members hoped that her killer would be brought to justice sooner rather than later. But several months went by after this, and the case remained a tough one for detectives to crack. In June 1963, 4 years after Candy's death, her father Carl sadly took his own life, unable to cope with losing his daughter. At the time, he had been living in a hotel in Walla Walla. Years went by and Candy began to fade from the memories of many, but her family and the detectives of Spokane Police Department never forgot. This is the kind of case that's been the giant logjam for cold cases, and in Spokane, I keep saying it's the Mount Everest of our cold cases, the one that we could never seem to overcome. But at the same time, nobody ever forgot, said Detective Zach Stormont of the Spokane Police Department Major Crimes. By 2001, there had been a significant advancement in DNA technology compared to the 1950s when it was non-existent. Candy's clothes from when her body was found had been carefully stored by the authorities as evidence. These clothes were now submitted to the lab with the hopes that the killer's DNA could be identified. Forensic investigators quickly got to work and they were able to determine that Candy's underwear had DNA on it. They were able to isolate DNA from this, and it was used to create a DNA profile. It was an exciting period for detectives as they felt closer than ever to solving the case. The newly developed DNA profile was then uploaded to the database, but unfortunately, no match was found. In 2002, detectives compared the DNA profile to that of Morse, who had remained on their radar for a long time. However, to their disappointment, they discovered that he was not the man they were looking for. Nothing of interest would surface for a long time. In September 2006, Candy's heartbroken mother quietly passed away in her home at the age of 82. She died not knowing who had killed her precious daughter. Around 2017, forensic genetic genealogy came to the limelight as a new scientific method being used to solve several cold cases. The method uses DNA analysis and traditional genealogical methods to solve crimes and identify missing persons. In other words, it combines science with family history research to piece together clues and bring justice to victims and their loved ones. With the method gaining popularity, detectives decided to give it a try and use it in helping them solve Candy's murder. Brittany Wright, a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division, got assigned to the case around the time she was able to get her hands on a DNA sample that had been stored in the crime lab freezer since 2001. The next thing she did was reanalyze the sample to confirm that it matched the original perpetrator's DNA profile from 2001. Upon confirming this, she followed up with a diagnostic analysis to determine if it could be used for forensic genetic genealogy. The sample was then sent to a private forensic lab. However, this turned out to be a futile effort as, according to the lab, the DNA sample was too degraded to work with. Detectives' hopes were completely dashed when they were given the news, and they could hardly hide their disappointment. A year would go by after this before detectives caught a lucky break. They learned about a particular laboratory that could efficiently work with degraded DNA like the one in Candy's case. The laboratory was known as Othram, and it was located in Texas. Brittany reached out to them to inquire if Candy's case was eligible. Upon receiving a positive response, she then sent off a small amount of the remaining DNA sample for testing. 6 months later, the lab came back with a result. 3 brothers have been identified as the possible suspects. Their names were John, Andrew, and Terry Hoff. As it turned out, all 3 were long dead upon further investigation. Detectives discovered that one of the men, John, had a daughter named Kathy. They decided to contact her to let her know that they were investigating her dead father. By that point, I had already looked up a little girl murdered in 1959, so I knew who it was, Kathy said. She provided detectives with a DNA sample which was then analyzed, and the result was astonishing. It revealed that it was 2.9 million times more likely that Kathy's DNA was related to the suspect DNA profile than the general population. With this, detectives became more certain that John was the killer they had spent decades looking for. They did a background check on him and discovered that in addition to growing up in Spokane, he lived about a mile from Candy's home at the time of her murder. He also had a troubled past. In 1956, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the Army. However, in 1961, 2 years after Candy's death, he was arrested for assaulting a woman. According to reports, he had approached the woman and used force to remove her clothes while she struggled and screamed for help. He then used the clothes to tie her up before trying to strangle her. Luckily, the woman survived the ordeal. For the crime, John spent 6 months in prison, and when he got out, the army labeled him a deserter and discharged him from service. After this, John led a pretty normal life. He worked as a door-to-door salesman and also in a lumberyard to make ends meet. However, at the young age of 31, he ended up taking his own life. Apart from this, detectives also uncovered a possible connection between John and Candy. Hoff's stepsister was a 10-year-old campfire girl at the time of Candy's murder and had taken on the role of Candy's big sister in the program. Detectives believed that this was how John might have known Candy. When detectives uncovered all this about John, they decided to take one final step to confirm that he was Candy's killer. With Kathy's permission, as well as a search warrant, they traveled to the cemetery where John was buried and exhumed his corpse. A DNA sample was taken from his remains and was then sent to the lab for testing. The result was what detectives expected. John was Candy's killer. "We got extremely lucky in that we got DNA from 1959, said former Spokane Police Detective Brian Hammond, who worked tirelessly on the case until he retired in 2021. They had no concept of that at the time, and that's obviously what cracks the case. Otherwise, I don't believe it would have ever been solved," Hammond added. Some of Candy's surviving relatives were contacted and informed about the breakthrough in the case. It's not closure, but at least there's some form of satisfaction knowing that the person that did it is at least named. "He may be in a grave, but he's named," said Joan Pass, a cousin of Candy, aged 77. Candy's relatives, however, remained saddened by the fact that her grandparents and parents never got to know who killed her. They never saw him pay or die for it or whatever. They went to their grave not knowing, and that was hard, Joan said. As for Kathy, the revelation that her father was the murderer shook her to the bones. "It's just really sad to find out that someone, not even just your dad, but someone in your family, could do something like that," Kathy said. "John passed away when she was only 9, and she grew up believing that he had done it out of depression. And now I think no, he was evil," she said. "It wasn't an escape and away from it, but he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, and he wasn't." Kathy also rendered a public apology for her father's crime and the pain it caused the murdered girl's family. "I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did, that he took her life horribly," she said. "I hope that it gives peace knowing that even though it's not really justice because he doesn't get any punishment, his name has this on it now and they can know it's solved." Through the act of one man, a family was plunged into misery and remained in the dark for more than 60 years. However, the determination and perseverance of several generations of detectives helped to reveal his identity and bring the bereaved family much-needed closure. And the night deepens. Thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.